A German philosopher noticed something simple and puzzling. Two people can look at the same situation and walk away with completely different understandings. They share the same world, yet their experience is not the same. Immanuel Kant wanted to discover why this happens. He explained that the mind works like a lens that shapes everything we see. It does not wait quietly for reality. It organizes every moment from the inside. What counts as an object, what feels right or wrong, what seems possible or impossible depends on how this lens works. Kant spent years trying to reveal this hidden structure. He studied how we perceive space and time, how we judge beauty, and why some moral decisions feel absolute. And he did all of this without leaving the small city where he lived his entire life. His idea is direct. The world you experience may come as much from your mind as from reality itself. Everything you know is backwards. For 2,000 years, philosophers assumed that knowledge works like a mirror. Your mind reflects the world. Objects exist independently, and your task is conforming your thoughts to match them. Understanding means making your mental picture correspond to external reality. This seems obvious. Kant discovered it was completely wrong. The revolution he proposed inverted the entire relationship. Objects do not determine how we think about them. Rather, our mental structures determine how objects can appear to us. Your mind is not passive mirror, but active organizer. Things must conform to your ways of experiencing them, not the other way around. This sounds absurd until you grasp what it explains. Consider space. You cannot imagine anything outside of space. Every object you perceive occupies spatial location. Yet space itself is never an object you perceive. You never see space independently of things in space. Where does space come from? Not from the external world, Kant argued, but from your own mind. Space is the form through which you structure all outer perception. Objects appear spatial because your mind imposes spatial form on whatever you experience. The same holds for time. Every event happens in time, yet time itself is not something you observe. You experience succession, duration, simultaneity, but never time as separate thing. Time is the form your mind uses to organize inner experience. Events appear temporal because consciousness structures them that way. Remove the mind and you do not have objects in space and time. You have nothing experienceable at all. This explains something that puzzled philosophers for centuries. How can mathematics be both necessarily true and informative about the world? Mathematical truth seems certain, unlike empirical observations that might be otherwise. Yet they also tell us something new, unlike mere logical tautologies. Traditional philosophy could not explain this combination. If math comes from pure logic, it should be empty. If it comes from experience, it should be uncertain. Kant solved the puzzle through his reversal. Mathematics is necessarily true because it describes the structures your mind imposes on experience. Geometry reveals the form of space that you contribute. Arithmetic reveals the form of time through which you count. These are not arbitrary inventions, but necessary features of how human minds work. Therefore, mathematical truths apply universally to anything you can experience. Yet they remain informative because they describe real structures of your cognition. This single insight transformed philosophy forever. After Kant, you could no longer naively assume that knowledge simply copies reality. Every subsequent thinker had to grapple with how the mind actively shapes what it knows. Nevertheless, this creates a troubling consequence. If objects must conform to our mental structures to be knowable, what about things as they exist independent of our minds? You have never seen a thing in itself. Everything you perceive comes filtered through your sensory apparatus and mental categories. The apple appears red because your visual system processes certain wavelengths. It seems solid because your touch receptors respond to molecular resistance. It tastes sweet because chemical compounds trigger specific tongue receptors. Remove your sensory equipment, and what remains? Not the apple as you experience it, but something utterly unknown. Kant called this distinction phenomena versus noumena, Phenomena are appearances, things as they show up for conscious beings with our particular cognitive structures. Noumena are things in themselves, reality as it exists, independent of any perspective. We have access only to phenomena. Noumena remain forever beyond our grasp. This seems devastating. If we can only know appearances, never reality itself, doesn't that make all knowledge merely subjective? Not quite. Phenomena are not illusions or distortions. They are the only reality we can meaningfully discuss. When you say the apple is red, you make a true claim about how the apple appears to human visual systems. This is objective knowledge, verifiable by others with similar perceptual equipment. What you cannot claim is knowledge of the apple independent of any perceptual apparatus whatsoever. Think about color blindness as an analogy. Someone who cannot distinguish red from green sees the world differently than you do. Neither of you perceives color as it exists in itself, since color requires interaction between light wavelengths and retinal receptors. Yet you both perceive real features of your shared world as processed through your respective visual systems. Similarly, all humans perceive phenomena through shared cognitive structures. We can have objective knowledge of appearances, even though we cannot know things in themselves. This limitation actually liberates philosophy from impossible tasks. Traditional metaphysics tried to prove God exists, the soul is immortal, the universe is finite or infinite. These questions concern noumena, things in themselves, beyond possible experience. Therefore, they cannot be answered through theoretical reason. No amount of logical argument or empirical observation can settle them because they transcend the boundaries of possible knowledge. Does this make metaphysics impossible? Only metaphysics that claims theoretical knowledge of things in themselves. Kant opened space for different kind of metaphysics, one grounded not in speculative reasoning about ultimate reality, but in analyzing the structures that make experience possible. Instead of asking what the soul really is, ask what makes self-consciousness possible. Instead of proving God exists, examine the moral grounds for religious belief. The questions shift from unknowable noumena to experienceable phenomena and their conditions. Nevertheless, if we can only know phenomena, and phenomena require our mental structures, what are these structures exactly? How many are there? How do they work? Answering these questions required Kant to catalog the fundamental concepts that organize all human understanding. Your mind uses 12 fundamental concepts to make sense of anything, not learned from experience, but brought to experience as tools for organizing it. Without these concepts, the world would be formless chaos, disconnected sensations without meaning or order. Kant called them categories, and identifying them was crucial to his entire philosophy. Consider causality. When you see a rock break a window, you do not merely observe two separate events, rock hitting glass and glass shattering. You perceive one event causing the other. Causation is not something you see in the world, like color or shape. Rather, causation is a concept your mind applies to organize temporal sequences into meaningful connections. You interpret the rock as producing the breaking through the category of cause and effect. This category is not optional. Try to imagine experience without causation. Events would just happen one after another with no connection. The rock hits, the glass breaks, but the hitting would not explain the breaking. They would be random succession rather than connected process. Yet you cannot actually experience this way. Your mind automatically applies causal categories to temporal sequences, making them intelligible as processes where earlier events produce later ones. Substance provides another example. When you see an apple change from green to red as it ripens, you perceive one thing undergoing transformation, not annihilation of green object and creation of red object. The category of substance lets you conceive persistent things with changing properties. Without this category, You could not distinguish objects from their qualities, could not track things through time, could not organize experience into a world of enduring entities. The 12 categories fall into 4 groups. Quantity includes unity, plurality, and totality, letting you think of objects as one, many, or all. Quality includes reality, negation, and limitation, letting you judge what properties things have or lack. Relation includes substance, causality, and reciprocity, letting you understand how things connect. Modality includes possibility, existence, and necessity, letting you judge different modes of being. These are not arbitrary classifications, but systematic derivation from forms of judgment. Every judgment takes specific logical form, universal or particular, affirmative or negative, categorical or hypothetical. Kant argued that for each form of judgment, a corresponding category must structure experience. Otherwise, you could not formulate judgments about experience at all. The categories are the concepts that make judgment, and therefore knowledge, possible. Kant published his critique of pure reason at age 57, after years of silence that worried his friends. The book was dense, technical, extraordinarily difficult, yet it contained insights that revolutionized philosophy. The categories were not the most famous part, but they were essential. They explained how raw sensory input becomes organized experience. Sensations give you the material of knowledge. Categories give you the form. Together they produce the structured, phenomenal world you inhabit. However, this raises urgent questions. If categories are not learned from experience, where do they come from? How are we justified in applying them? What guarantees that reality must conform to these concepts? Answering required Kant's most difficult and controversial argument, one that generations of philosophers have struggled to fully understand. All bachelors are unmarried. This statement is necessarily true, yet it tells you nothing new. If you understand what bachelor means, you already know bachelors are unmarried. The predicate is contained in the subject. Kant called these analytic judgments. They clarify concepts but add no information. Logic alone determines their truth. The apple is red. This statement adds new information. Red is not contained in the concept of apple. You need to look at specific apples to discover their colors. Kant called these synthetic judgments. They extend knowledge by connecting concepts that have no necessary logical relationship. Experience determines whether they are true or false. Every philosopher before Kant accepted this division. Analytic judgments are certain but empty. Synthetic judgments are informative but uncertain. Necessary truths come from logic and definition. Empirical truths come from observation and experiment. Then Kant asked a question that changed everything. What about mathematics? 7 plus 5 equals 12. Is this analytic or synthetic? It seems necessarily true, like a logical tautology. Yet 12 is not contained in the concepts of 7, 5, or addition. You could analyze those concepts forever without finding 12, unless you actually performed the operation. The judgment is synthetic, adding information not logically contained in its terms. However, it is also certain, known independently of any empirical observation. You do not need to check 7 apples plus 5 apples repeatedly to be sure the sum is 12. This is synthetic a priori knowledge. Synthetic because it extends understanding beyond mere concept analysis. A priori because it is necessary and universal, known prior to and independent of particular experiences. Mathematics is full of such judgments. So is physics. Every event has a cause. Matter is conserved. These principles are not derived from observing many cases and generalizing. Rather, they structure how you can experience events and objects at all. Traditional philosophy could not explain synthetic a priori judgments. Rationalists like Leibniz claimed all necessary truths are analytic, derived from the principle of non-contradiction. This makes mathematics empty tautology. Empiricists like Hume claimed all informative. Judgments are synthetic, a posterior, derived from experience. This makes mathematical certainty impossible to explain. Both positions failed because they missed the third category. Kant's answer was his Copernican Revolution applied here. Synthetic a priori judgments are possible because they describe the structures your mind imposes on experience. When you judge that every event has a cause, you are not discovering a feature of things in themselves. Rather, you are expressing the fact that your understanding necessarily applies causal categories to temporal sequences. The judgment is synthetic because causation adds something not logically contained in the concept of event. It is a priori because your mind cannot experience events any other way. Space and time provide the clearest examples. Geometric truths are synthetic because conclusions add information beyond what definitions contain. Triangle having angles summing to 180 degrees is not contained in the concept of three-sided figure. Yet geometric truths are a priori because they describe necessary features of spatial form. You cannot perceive spatial objects any other way. Therefore, synthetic a priori geometry is possible through the nature of spatial intuition itself. Nevertheless, this requires examining space and time more carefully. What exactly are they? How do they function as conditions of experience? Understanding this demanded a detailed analysis of what Kant called the transcendental aesthetic, the investigation of pure forms of sensibility. Close your eyes and imagine absolutely nothing. Not darkness, which is still visual, not silence, which is auditory. Pure nothing. You cannot do it. Every act of imagination places content somewhere and somewhen. The somewhere is space, the somewhen is time. Neither can be removed from experience. Space is not a thing you perceive, but the form through which you perceive all outer things. When you see a book on a table, you see them in spatial relations. The book is on the table, not inside it or beside it. These spatial positions are not properties of the objects themselves, as if book and table carry their locations with them independently. Rather, your sensory apparatus organizes visual and tactile data spatially. Space is the structure you impose, not something existing independent of perception. Kant offered several arguments for this. First, you can imagine space empty of all objects, but you cannot imagine objects existing outside of space. Space is presupposed by every outer perception. Second, space has only one instance. You do not encounter multiple separate spaces, but one unified spatial framework containing all locations. This unity comes from the form of your outer sense, not from the multiplicity of external things. Third, geometric truths are synthetic a priori because they describe necessary features of this spatial form. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, not because you have measured all possible pairs of points empirically, but because Euclidean space necessarily has this structure. Geometry reveals the nature of the form through which you perceive outer objects. Therefore, geometric propositions apply necessarily to everything you can experience in space. Time functions similarly for inner sense. Every conscious state occurs in temporal sequence. Thoughts, feelings, perceptions, all have temporal location. Before, during, after, simultaneous. These are not features you observe, but forms through which you organize experience. Time is the structure of inner sense, the way consciousness orders its contents. You cannot represent simultaneity except by imagining events at the same temporal point. You cannot represent succession except through time. Every act of consciousness places its contents in temporal relations. Even when you think about timeless abstractions like mathematical truths, the thinking itself happens in time. Your mental states flow in temporal sequence even when their content concerns non-temporal matters. This explains why arithmetic is synthetic a priori. Counting requires successive addition. 3 plus 4 equals 7 through the temporal process of counting from 3 to 7. The number 7 is not contained in the concepts of 3 and 4. You reach it through temporal operation, yet this operation is necessary, following from the structure of time itself. Therefore, arithmetic applies universally to anything experienceable, since everything must appear in temporal form. Space and time are pure forms of intuition. Intuition means immediate awareness, direct presentation rather than conceptual thought. Form means they structure content without being content themselves. Pure means they exist prior to and independent of particular experiences. You do not learn space and time from experience. Rather, space and time make experience possible. This has radical consequences. Space and time apply only to phenomena, things as they appear to sensing beings. You cannot say whether things in themselves are spatial or temporal. Perhaps noumena exist in completely different modes. You have no way of knowing. What you do know is that anything experienced by humans must conform to spatial and temporal structures because those are the forms of human sensibility. Nevertheless, sensibility alone does not produce knowledge. Raw sensory data in space and time remains formless without concepts to organize it. Understanding applies categories to sensible intuition, synthesizing the manifold into unified experience. How this synthesis works, how categories legitimately connect to sensory content, required Kant's most difficult argument. Why should the world obey rules of human understanding? Your mind uses categories like causality and substance to organize experience. Yet what guarantees that reality must conform to these concepts? Perhaps objects operate according to principles completely foreign to human categories. This threat of radical disconnection between mind and world drove Kant to his most complex argument, the transcendental deduction of the categories. The argument begins with a simple but profound insight. The phrase, "I think," must be able to accompany all your representations. Every experience you have, every thought you entertain, every perception you undergo must be potentially conscious to you as yours. Otherwise, it would not be part of your mental life at all. This self-consciousness, this awareness that experiences belong to a single unified subject, is what Kant called the transcendental unity of apperception. This unity is not something you discover through introspection. You do not observe a substantial self enduring through time. Rather, the unity is the necessary condition for having any experience at all. Imagine your perceptions were completely disconnected, each sensation belonging to a different subject with no common consciousness tying them together. You would not have experience of a world, but scattered fragments without connection. For experience to be experience for you, it must be unified under one consciousness. Now comes the crucial step. This unity of consciousness requires that the manifold of sensory data be synthesized according to rules. Random chaos cannot form unified experience. When you see a house, you do not perceive random patches of color and shape. Rather, you synthesize the visual data into representation of a unified object with parts in determinate relations. This synthesis happens through categories. The category of substance lets you conceive the house as one enduring thing. The category of causality lets you understand the door as producing opening when pushed. The category of plurality lets you recognize multiple windows as parts of one whole. Without categorical synthesis, the sensory manifold would remain disconnected chaos, incapable of forming unified experience. Therefore, categories are necessary conditions for the unity of apperception. The argument concludes that categories must apply to all possible experience because experience requires unified consciousness, and unified consciousness requires categorical synthesis. Objects as experienced cannot violate categories like causality or substance without ceasing to be objects for consciousness at all. This does not mean things in themselves obey these rules. Rather, anything that appears to you must conform to the structures necessary for appearance to unified consciousness. Critics have struggled with this argument for 2 centuries. The reasoning is compressed, technical, extraordinarily difficult to follow. Kant himself lived his entire life in Königsberg, never traveling more than 40 miles from his birthplace. Yet from this single city he revolutionized Western thought through arguments of unprecedented complexity. The Transcendental deduction stands as perhaps his most challenging contribution. Nevertheless, the core insight is clear. You cannot separate the possibility of experience from the structures that make experience experienceable. Categories are not arbitrary impositions, but necessary conditions for unified consciousness. Therefore, the phenomenal world must conform to categories, because the phenomenal world is precisely the world as experienceable by beings with our cognitive constitution. The limitation to phenomena is simultaneously the guarantee that knowledge is possible within those limits. This completes the theoretical philosophy. Kant established the boundaries of possible knowledge, showing what can be known and why metaphysics beyond experience fails. However, he was not finished. Morality, aesthetics, politics, all required investigation. The same critical method applied to practical reason would reveal structures of moral consciousness as necessary and universal as the structures of theoretical understanding. Should you tell the truth? Most people answer yes, but then add conditions. Tell the truth unless it hurts someone's feelings. Be honest except when a lie protects the innocent. Speak truthfully as long as it serves your goals. These conditional rules are what Kant called hypothetical imperatives. They command only if you have certain desires or aims. A hypothetical imperative has the form, if you want X, then do Y. If you want to stay healthy, exercise regularly. If you want people to trust you, keep your promises. If you want to avoid punishment, obey the law. The command depends on the antecedent condition. Remove the desire and the imperative loses its force. Someone who does not care about health has no reason to exercise. Someone who does not value trust need not keep promises. Morality cannot work this way. Moral obligations bind you regardless of your desires, goals, or interests. You ought not to murder even if you want to, even if murder would benefit you, even if you have no natural inclination toward respecting life. The moral law commands categorically, without conditions. This is the categorical imperative. Kant formulated it several ways, but the most famous version is this: act only according to that maxim, through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. In simpler terms, before acting, ask whether you could rationally want everyone to act on the same principle. If universalizing your maxim produces contradiction or something you cannot coherently will, the action is morally forbidden. Consider lying. When you lie, you act on the maxim. I will make false statements when it serves my purposes. Can you will this as universal law? No. If everyone lied whenever convenient, communication would break down. Nobody would believe anyone else. The practice of making promises, which lying exploits, would cease to exist. You cannot coherently will a world where lying is universal law, because such a world undermines the very conditions that make lying effective. Therefore, lying violates the categorical imperative. The same test applies to all actions. Refusing to help others when you could easily do so fails because you cannot will a world where nobody helps anyone. You might someday need assistance yourself. Breaking promises fails because universal promise-breaking destroys the institution of promising. Stealing fails because universal theft eliminates property rights that theft presupposes. The categorical imperative systematically rules out actions that involve treating moral rules as applying to others but not to yourself. This is not consequentialist reasoning about outcomes. Kant was not saying lying is wrong because it produces bad results. Rather, lying is inherently irrational, involving a logical contradiction when universalized. You use a practice while simultaneously willing its destruction. The wrongness is in the structure of the maxim itself, not in its consequences. Furthermore, the categorical imperative applies absolutely. No exceptions based on circumstances, desires, or competing goods. You must never lie, even to save innocent life. This rigidity disturbs many readers. Surely consequences sometimes matter? Kant disagreed. The moment you allow exceptions, morality collapses into hypothetical imperatives. You are honest except when dishonesty serves some purpose. That is not genuine moral commitment, but prudential calculation disguised as ethics. The categorical imperative commands unconditionally because reason itself commands it. Not external authority, not social convention, not divine decree, but your own rational nature as legislating moral law. This self-legislation is autonomy, and understanding it reveals what freedom actually means, what controls your actions. Most people are heteronomous, ruled by forces outside themselves. Desire dictates their choices. Social pressure determines their behavior. Fear of punishment or hope for reward motivates their conduct. They are not truly free, but reactive, responding to external pushes and pulls. Heteronomy comes in many forms. Following your desires seems like freedom. You do what you want, yet desires arise unbidden. You do not choose to be hungry or lustful or ambitious. These inclinations happen to you, then control your behavior. Acting on desire is slavery to biological and psychological forces, not genuine freedom. The drug addict does what he wants. That does not make him free. Social conformity is another heteronomy. You act according to cultural norms, peer expectations, or authority figures. Even when you internalize these standards until they feel like your own values, they remain external impositions. You were conditioned into them through upbringing and social pressure. Your behavior follows patterns established by others, not laws you genuinely gave yourself. Even religious morality can be heteronomous if you obey divine commands merely from fear of punishment or hope for reward. Acting morally because God will punish disobedience means your motivation comes from outside, from consequences you wish to avoid. True moral worth requires different foundation. Autonomy is self-legislation through reason. When you act according to the categorical imperative, you follow a law you give yourself through rational reflection. Nobody forces you to universalize your maxims. Rather, your own reason demands consistency. You recognize that making exceptions for yourself while expecting others to follow rules involves logical contradiction. This recognition arises from within your rational nature. Consider the difference concretely. You keep a promise because you fear breaking it will damage your reputation. That is heteronomy, acting from external consequence. You keep it because you love the person and want them happy. Still heteronomy, acting from inclination. You keep it because you recognize that willing, universal promise-breaking contradicts itself. That is autonomy. Acting from rational principle, you legislated for yourself. This is genuine freedom, not doing whatever you want, which makes you slave to desires, not following rules imposed by others, which makes you instrument of external will. Freedom is rational self-determination, giving yourself moral law through reason and acting according to that law regardless of inclinations or consequences. Only autonomous action is truly free, because only then are you author of the principles governing your conduct. Kant's account seems paradoxical. Freedom is following necessary rational law? How is that freedom, rather than constraint? The answer is that external constraints limit freedom, while self-imposed rational principles constitute it. When physical force prevents you from moving, that is limitation. When desire compels you to act against better judgment, that is limitation. When reason determines that certain maxims cannot be universalized, that is not limitation, but recognition of what your own rational nature requires. You are free when you act according to laws you give yourself, not when you are buffeted by forces outside your control. Nevertheless, this raises questions about motivation. If you act from duty, following the categorical imperative because reason requires it, what about your natural feelings? What about compassion, love, sympathy? Do these matter morally? Kant's answer seems harsh, but reveals something important about moral worth. Intelligence can be used for evil. Courage can serve terrible ends. Even happiness can corrupt when it makes villains complacent. Every human quality you might name has potential for misuse. Talents, character traits, external goods, all depend on will directing them. Only goodwill is unconditionally good, valuable in itself regardless of what it achieves. Goodwill means the will to do right because it is right, not for consequences, not from inclination, but from recognition of moral duty. This seems to devalue natural feelings. A person helps others from genuine compassion. Another helps from strict sense of duty despite feeling no natural sympathy. Kant claimed the second person's action has greater moral worth. This troubles many readers. The distinction is subtle. Kant was not saying compassionate action is wrong or worthless. Rather, he distinguished acting from duty versus acting in accordance with duty. When you help someone because you love them and want them happy, you act rightly. Your action conforms to what duty requires. Yet the moral worth comes not from the loving feeling, but from respect for moral law that would obligate you to help even without the feeling. Consider a shopkeeper who charges honest prices. Scenario 1. He does so because dishonesty would ruin his reputation and hurt business. His action accords with duty but has no moral worth. The motive is self-interest, not respect for moral law. Scenario 2. He naturally enjoys treating customers fairly and feels good doing so. His action accords with duty and has some worth. But the motivation is inclination toward fairness, not pure respect for duty itself. Scenario 3. He dislikes customers, resents the work, would prefer overcharging them. Nevertheless, he charges honest prices because duty requires it regardless of his feelings. This action has genuine moral worth. He acts from respect for moral law itself, overcoming contrary inclinations through rational commitment to what is right. The moral worth lies in the will's determination to do duty for duty's sake. This does not mean cold, reluctant virtue is better than warm, enthusiastic goodness. Rather, moral worth attaches to the aspect of action that comes from respect for law, not to feelings that happen to accompany it. When you help someone, both from compassion and from duty, your action has moral worth because duty motivates it. The compassion is admirable and praiseworthy, but belongs to your natural temperament, not to your moral character, strictly speaking. Kant's daily walks were so punctual that neighbors in Königsberg set their clocks by them, until one day he read Rousseau's Emile and was so absorbed he missed his walk entirely, alarming the town. This rigorous adherence to schedule reflected his conception of duty. Not spontaneous feeling, but rational commitment to principle governed his life. Yet he also experienced genuine enthusiasm, as when Rousseau moved him so deeply, he broke his famous routine. The key insight is that moral worth requires the right motive, not just right action. Two people perform identical helpful acts. One does so from duty, the other from self-interest. Externally indistinguishable, yet morally different. You cannot judge moral worth by observing behavior alone. Rather, you must examine whether the person acted from respect for moral law or from other motives that happen to align with duty. This becomes clearer when considering Kant's vision of the ideal moral community where rational beings treat each other as they ought. This community is the kingdom of ends, and understanding it reveals the deepest meaning of the categorical imperative. Your boss asks you to lie to a client. You refuse, not because you fear getting caught, but because lying treats the client as mere tool for profit. You recognize the client as a person who deserves truth, someone whose rational nature commands respect regardless of how useful deceiving them might be. This recognition embodies what Kant called the formula of humanity. The categorical imperative has several formulations. The universal law formula asks whether you could will your maxim as law for everyone. The formula of humanity states it differently. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always as an end and never merely as a means. These are not separate principles, but the same moral law expressed two ways. What does it mean to treat someone as an end? It means respecting their capacity for rational self-determination. Every person can set their own purposes, make their own choices, legislate moral law through their own reason. This rational autonomy gives persons absolute worth that must be honored. You violate this when you manipulate, deceive, coerce, or use people as instruments for your purposes without their rational consent. Notice the qualification, never merely as means. You inevitably use people as means constantly. The cashier is means to completing your purchase. The doctor is means to restoring your health. The teacher is means to gaining knowledge. This is not wrong. What is wrong is treating people only as means, ignoring their status as rational agents with their own purposes. You treat the cashier properly when you respect their dignity, even while using their services. You violate their humanity when you treat them as vending machine, mere function without personhood. Lying provides clear example. When you lie to someone, you manipulate them as tool for your purposes. You deny them the truth they need to make rational decisions. Their actions become means to your ends without their genuine consent, since they consented based on false information. The lie reduces a rational being to mere instrument, violating their dignity as person capable of self-determination. This applies equally to yourself. You must treat your own humanity as end, never merely as means. Suicide violates this by using your person as means to escape suffering, destroying the rational nature in yourself. Degrading addictions violate it by reducing yourself to passive reactor to physical cravings, rather than autonomous rational agent. Even neglecting to develop your talents violates it by treating your rational capacities as less important than immediate comfort. The kingdom of ends is the ideal community where everyone treats everyone, including themselves, according to this principle. A kingdom is realm under common laws. Ends means that each member is both legislator and subject simultaneously. Every person helps create the moral laws through their own reason, and every person is bound by those same laws. Nobody is exempt. Nobody is mere subject ruled by others. All are autonomous legislators in universal moral community. In this kingdom, persons have dignity rather than price. Things have price when they can be exchanged for equivalent value. A chair worth $100 can be replaced by anything else worth $100. Persons cannot be priced because they are irreplaceable. Your worth as rational being is not comparable to any sum of money, any quantity of pleasure, any collection of goods. Dignity means worth beyond all price, value that cannot be traded or substituted. This explains why slavery is absolutely wrong regardless of how well slaves are treated. It treats persons as commodities with market price. This explains why prostitution degrades even when consensual, because it prices what should have dignity. This explains why you cannot justify harming innocents even to save many lives, because you would be treating the innocent as means to social benefit, denying their irreplaceable worth. The kingdom of ends is regulative ideal, not existing society. No human community perfectly embodies it. Nevertheless, it guides moral action by showing what we ought to strive toward. Every time you respect someone's autonomy, refuse to manipulate or deceive, honor their rational nature, you partially realize the kingdom of ends. Every time you violate these principles, you act against the moral community that reason demands. This moral vision extended beyond individual ethics to aesthetics. Kant recognized that experiences of beauty and sublimity reveal something important about human nature, something that bridges the gap between natural causation and moral freedom. You stand before a painting and judge it beautiful, not just personally pleasing, but beautiful as such, worthy of universal appreciation. Yet you cannot prove this judgment through concepts or arguments. Beauty is not property you demonstrate like chemical composition or geometric structure. Nevertheless, you expect others to agree. This peculiar combination of subjectivity and universality defines aesthetic judgment. Beautiful objects, please, without concept. When you find something beautiful, the pleasure does not come from knowing what the object is for or what category it belongs to. A rose is beautiful not because you understand its biological function or can classify it botanically. The form itself pleases in immediate intuition, without mediation, through concepts. This distinguishes aesthetic pleasure from intellectual satisfaction or sensory gratification. Furthermore, beautiful objects please without personal interest. You are not judging whether the object serves your purposes or satisfies your desires. The pleasure is disinterested, arising from contemplation of the form itself rather than from any use you might make of it. When you enjoy a sunset, you are not calculating how it benefits you. The beauty lies in the free play of your cognitive faculties, imagination and understanding, harmonizing without definite concept. This creates paradox. Aesthetic judgments are subjective, based on feeling rather than proof, yet they claim universal validity. When you call something beautiful, you do not mean merely that you happen to like it, as when you prefer vanilla over chocolate. Rather, you claim everyone with properly functioning aesthetic sensibility ought to find it beautiful. The judgment is subjectively universal, expecting agreement without being able to compel it through argument. The sublime differs from beauty in important ways. Beautiful objects are small or medium-sized with pleasing forms. The sublime overwhelms through magnitude or power. You experience the mathematical sublime when confronting vast magnitude that exceeds your imagination's capacity to grasp. Standing before the ocean or gazing at the night sky, you cannot take in the whole at once. Your imagination fails while your reason conceives the infinite. This failure produces mixed feeling of pain and pleasure. The dynamical sublime arises from overwhelming power, a violent storm, an erupting volcano, a towering waterfall. These threaten physical harm, yet you experience them from safe distance. Your empirical self, your body and sensory nature, recognizes its vulnerability. Nevertheless, your rational self, your moral personality, feels elevated above nature. You discover within yourself a capacity that exceeds all physical power, the ability to resist natural inclination through moral law. Aesthetic judgment bridges nature and freedom. Nature operates according to deterministic laws. Causality governs every event. Human beings as phenomenal creatures are part of this causal order. Yet, as moral agents, you are free, capable of acting according to rational principles that transcend natural causation. How can both be true? Aesthetic experience provides hint. When you judge beauty, you find purposiveness without purpose. Natural forms appear designed, yet have no actual design. This suggests nature might accommodate human purposes, even though mechanistic laws govern it. The harmony you feel in aesthetic pleasure reflects possible harmony between natural order and moral demands. The sublime reveals rational capacities transcending nature while remaining embodied in it. These insights remained theoretical. Kant also addressed practical question of how human communities could organize themselves to realize moral ideals. His final vision was perpetual peace, the cosmopolitan order that reason both demands and makes possible. War is perpetual human condition. States compete for resources, security, and dominance. Conflict seems inevitable given scarcity and competing interests. Yet Kant argued that perpetual peace is not naive fantasy, but rational necessity and moral duty. The question is how to achieve it. 3 definitive articles establish conditions for lasting peace. First, every state must have republican constitution, not democracy in the sense of direct majority rule, but representative government with separation of powers. The crucial feature is that the people who must fight wars have voice in deciding whether to wage them. When those who bear war's costs also make decisions about war, they will be far more reluctant to choose conflict. Monarchs and Autocrats wage war easily because they do not personally suffer consequences. Citizens who must fight and die will choose peace when possible. Second, international law must be founded on federation of free states, not world government that eliminates sovereignty, which would create global tyranny. Rather, voluntary federation where independent states agree to resolve disputes through law instead of force. This federation has no enforcement power to compel members. Rather, it works through moral commitment and mutual interest. States join because remaining in lawless condition of constant potential war becomes intolerable. Third, cosmopolitan law must establish universal hospitality. This does not mean unlimited immigration or open borders. Rather, it means travelers and strangers have right not to be treated as enemies simply for arriving in foreign territory. States cannot attack foreigners merely for existing. Merchants, explorers, refugees have right to attempt peaceful contact. They can be refused entry but not destroyed for seeking it. This minimal right establishes that all humans share one Earth and must tolerate each other's presence. These conditions make perpetual peace possible but not inevitable. Achieving them requires moral progress over time. Nature assists through mechanisms that work even without human virtue. Commercial interdependence makes war costly. Cultural exchange creates mutual understanding. Geographic distribution of peoples prevents universal empire. Nevertheless, these natural mechanisms are not sufficient. Moral commitment to peace must drive political reform. Peace is not merely pragmatic goal, but moral duty. War treats human beings as means to state purposes, violating their dignity as ends in themselves. International violence denies the universal moral community that reason demands. You cannot will universal war as law because it contradicts the kingdom of ends where rational beings coexist under self-legislated principles. Therefore, working toward peace is categorical imperative for states as for individuals. The vision seems idealistic. States remain in violent competition centuries after Kant wrote. Yet he was not predicting inevitable progress, but articulating rational ideal toward which humanity ought to strive. Each step toward republican government, international law, and cosmopolitan right partially realizes the ideal, even if complete achievement remains distant. The goal guides action without guaranteeing success. Kant died in 1804, having transformed Western philosophy through relentless analysis from his study in Königsberg. He never witnessed the global conflicts of the 20th century or the international institutions of the 21st, yet his argument remains relevant. Perpetual peace is not empirical prediction but moral demand. Reason requires that rational beings organize themselves peacefully. Whether they do so depends on their willingness to make autonomy, dignity, and the kingdom of ends guiding principles for political as well as personal life. The moral law within commands it. The starry heavens above provide no answer. The choice belongs to human freedom itself.